Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. Today is Monday, May 20th. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today, we'll be talking about this weekend's biggest news from around the WNBA, including injuries to Nneka Ogwumike and Brittney Sykes. We'll also talk about some of our favorite WNBA fantasy trade targets and players that we'd like to trade away. And we'll preview our favorite matchups for this week, including a couple of matchups including the Fever. Those looking to use RotoWire's full slate of tools this season can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. And don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're watching this show. Viewers can also ask questions in the comment section, and we'll answer them during the show if they're live. Otherwise, we'll do our best to answer them after the fact if you're watching on replay. There was plenty of excitement during the first weekend of WNBA action, including a double overtime matchup between Seattle and Minnesota. However, Nneka Ogwumike sustained an ankle injury during that matchup and was unable to play for unavailable Sunday. It's unclear whether she'll be available for Monday's game, but Kirien, if she misses multiple games, who do you think could step up for Seattle?
All right, so we should get official clarity on Nneka's injury sometime this afternoon. She's considered questionable tonight, game time decision, standard stuff. But her absence Sunday could have just been like a rest day for the ankle, given it was the first half of a back-to-back, the first back-to-back in the W this season, but we got a couple of those this week. If Nneka misses extended time, I'd turn to Mercedes Russell. She started and played 30 minutes Sunday. She wasn't super productive, 8 points, 3 of 6 from the field, 5 boards and 2 steals, but she was a plus 22 in a 9-point win. That she made a big impact on the team winning that game. So I expect her to get plenty of run if Nneka is sidelined for multiple games. Jordan Horston is also a high upside option. She played only 15 minutes off the bench Sunday after playing 23 and 36 in the previous 2 games. The 36 was a double OT game versus Minnesota. So Seattle plays 3 games this week, so there definitely is some value to be had in Russell and or Horston if Nneka misses more time.
Yeah, and Seattle is an interesting team with this injury because Ezi Magbegor, there's no shortage of talent that she has. So even though Russell and Horston could see increased playing time, like Ezi Magbegor could see just a massive role if Nneka is sidelined for a few games. And like even if Ogwumike is available and maybe slightly limited, I really like Ezi Magbegor this week. She was someone who I was fading a little bit during draft talk, but she has really performed well to begin the season with and without Ogwumike. So they have a lot of players who should be able to step up. Another injury that we saw pop up was Brittney Sykes' ankle issue. She'll be traveling with the team this week and is officially labeled as day-to-day. But her absence has allowed other guards to step up, including Carly Samuelson, Julie Van Loo, and Shatori Walker-Kimbrough. Out of these 3 players, I think that Samuelson definitely has the most season-long value. She was someone that we were talking about a little bit prior to the season, but Van Loo has also impressed early in the regular season. She's had double-digit ESPN fantasy points in every game, and she's kind of occupied the role that I expected Walker-Kimbrough to have. So I expected those two to not have massive roles, but I expected the slight advantage to go to Walker-Kimbrough. But it's been Van Loo's position as the 3rd or 4th guard right now in Washington.
Yeah, I don't think the WNBA fantasy world is doing dynasty leagues yet or anything. Van Loo is a rookie, but she is 31 years old. So I'll just throw that out there. She's not a dynasty option. I don't think there's any dynasty leagues yet, but we should start one. That would be fun. Walker-Kimbrough, Van Loo, there's plenty of options here in Washington. Sykes' injury did not look good initially. The Mystics are kind of optimistic that she'll be back sometime soon, but I wouldn't be surprised if she missed at least one of Washington's 3 road games this week. They play in LA on Tuesday, in Phoenix on Thursday, and in Seattle on Saturday. Walker Kimbrough was productive off the bench Sunday without Sykes, 12 points. She was super efficient from the field, 5 for 7 from the field, made both of her three-pointers, 3 steals and a block, but she was a minus 14 in 20 minutes. So while she was being able to put up production, it wasn't really helping the team. Van Loo struggled in her first start from the field, 2 of 8 from the field, 1 of 5 from deep. She had nearly as many turnovers. She had 4 turnovers as assists. She had 5 dimes, and she committed 5 fouls. So while there was some production there, it wasn't great for either of those players. Van Loo's assist production probably gives her the edge over Walker Kimbrough in the short term for me, but you probably have to hope for a better shooting night if you want like consistent production from Van Loo moving forward.
Yeah, and something that we'll talk about a lot this season is the difference between real life value and fantasy value. So with a player like Van Loo, 4 turnovers and 5 fouls isn't good for the Mystics as a whole, which could lead to her playing time dropping at some point. But for fantasy managers, especially early in the season, it's like you have to kind of ride the hot hand while you can, and you don't lose points for turnovers in ESPN Fantasy Standard League. So Van Loo is still a viable option at this point in the year.
100%. And talking about hot hand, Carly Samuelson is 7 for 12 from 3 over her last 2 games. So you got to ride that while she's hot for sure, especially if Sykes is out and there's that missing, 15 shots from Sykes that she usually takes.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the WNBA season being just 40 games, there aren't many weeks in a fantasy season, so it's important to identify trade value early. Even after just 1 week, there are several players that we're looking at that you can target from opposing managers to help bolster your team. Sticking with the Mystics, with the first trade candidate, Shakira Austin has had her minutes limited early in the season, and she sat out yesterday's game Sunday. But I think that she's a great target. Her minutes restriction could steer other fantasy managers away, but it wouldn't surprise me if she's able to handle a bigger role soon. She's been really efficient when on the court. She's averaged 11.5 points and 7 rebounds in just 20.5 minutes per game. So the per minute value has been there, and she was someone that we were looking at early in the season as well, before the season, as someone who could step up without Elena Deladon. And granted, her minutes have been limited, which is slightly limited her upside, but it's really exciting to think about what she could do when she's able to handle a full slate of minutes.
I think I'm targeting Austin if I have a pretty good starting lineup right now. If I won week 1, I'm feeling good. I don't have too many injuries. I don't have Chelsea Gray, Jordan Canada, Brittney Griner on my Natasha Howard. I don't have major holes in my lineup right now, and I can kind of just stash her. The minutes restriction doesn't scare me, but missing games does scare me. If you're missing one of every 4 games, that significantly impacts value of a player. I don't think that'll continue as the season goes on because, like you said, she looks really good when she's out on the court. So this is kind of just precautionary stuff. But so yeah, I'm targeting Austin in leagues where I feel good about my lineup, and that kind of gives me that X factor for later in the season when she's playing 28, 30 minutes and she's averaging 18 points and 10 boards type of deal.
Yeah, and the Mystics do really have a history of managing workloads with Elena Deladon over the past few years. And granted, Deladon is a little bit of a unique case because of just how many injuries she's dealt with and just overall lack of availability, which isn't really her fault. But I think that the Mystics are really they seem fine with just managing players' workload so that they can be more available down the stretch.
That's a great point. So my first trade candidate is Aliyah Boston. After a Rookie of the Year campaign in 2023, Boston's numbers are down across the board to start 2024. Indiana has struggled as a whole. They're trying to adopt a new style with Caitlin Clark in tow. In my opinion, it's kind of like they are combating 2 different styles. They're trying to play like they did last year and then trying to incorporate Caitlin. Once they fully embrace Caitlin and they start scoring at a high clip, there's going to be a ton of production for Boston to be had. Right now, only through 3 games, but Indiana is currently last in offensive and defensive efficiency. That's not great. I think that'll change. And I think they'll start scoring more. I think they'll still give up points, but I feel like the Fever should be an ideal fantasy team, right? Like they're going to put up a bunch of numbers, sacrificing their defense, which, is whatever. You can also target players playing the Fever and there'll be more points available. So yeah, Aliyah Boston, she is a rookie of the year. We were expecting really big things from her, like early second round, maybe late second round pick. Like we thought that was ideal. If someone's already trying to move on from her, you should try to snatch her up instantly. I don't expect this to continue all season. She's averaging like less than 10 points per game right now. Indiana also plays 4 games this week. So if you're trying to trade for Boston, try to get that in ASAP to get as much value as possible this week.
Yeah, and Indiana's really been, I guess, in the social media headlines, we should say, of people who were really expecting big things from Caitlin Clark early on and have been a little bit disappointed early in the season. But it's not really Clark's or Indiana's fault. We'll talk about this later on in the show a little bit, but the Fever are going through a gauntlet of an early season schedule with matchups against the Sun, against the Liberty. They'll play the Aces next week. So they are really getting their toes wet with against some of the team's top talent, and they're doing so while trying to build chemistry among a young roster. So I think that the upside will be there for the players later in the season, but it's just a matter of when that'll happen. But I think that'll be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, Aliyah Boston had to go up against Jonquel Jones twice, and Connecticut's front court, which features multiple great options. So 100%. And I think we'll talk about it later too, like you said, but there's just like no easy games in the WNBA, man. Like all of these teams have talent and they're ready to grind. And so it's going to be a challenge for the Fever all year long, but I feel like they'll find their footing eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if she's someone to trade away at this point, given how little production she's had, but I've been kind of discouraged with Diamond Miller's role with the Lynx. She underwent knee surgery in November, and it carried a recovery timetable of approximately 6 weeks. So heading into the season, I wasn't too concerned about her, but it seems like she's clearly been on a minutes restriction to begin the season. During the regular season opener, I wasn't sure if her role had simply declined, but in Friday's double overtime win over Seattle, she didn't see the court during either overtime period. So, unless if she's really fallen out of favor with the team, she appears to be on a fairly strict minutes restriction, which is especially discouraging with Dorka Juhas unavailable. You would think that with Juhas out, Nafisa Collier has absolutely taken on a leading role, as you would expect, but you would think that Diamond Miller would see a little bit more playing time, but the increased production has really gone to Alana Smith and some of their other offseason additions like Courtney Williams and Natisha Heidemann. So it makes you wonder if this is a full minutes restriction or if it's just kind of Cheryl Reeve modifying her rotation early in the season.
Yeah, super concerning on the part of Miller. I think I dropped her in one league, but it's not like a very active league, so I'm assuming no one's like really going to pick her up since her production hasn't even been worthy of a pickup right now. But she is still a young player, and I feel like she should have a role. But Minnesota's competing like right now, right? Like they're consensus top 4 team in the league right now based off of the Athletic and ESPN power rankings that came out this morning. So I feel like Miller eventually will get playing time. Maybe if an injury happens, or maybe it won't happen until an injury happens or something. But Miller is definitely a concerning fantasy target right now. So moving on from someone who was very disappointing to someone who's been absolutely surprising this year in a good way is DiJonai Carrington. Absolutely fantastic to start the season. She hounded Caitlin Clark, made her turn it over a bunch of times in that opener. She's averaging 18.5 points and 1.5 steals in 33.5 minutes per game to start the season. She's never been a full-time starter. She never averaged more than 18 minutes in a game this season. So I'm going to sell high right now. Like I feel like maybe a player in your fantasy league hasn't followed the WNBA super closely until this year, and they're like, oh, Carrington's a superstar. I don't know if I'm ready to put her on that level yet. I think she's a very solid player, but I think this offense runs through Alyssa Thomas, right? She's going to dominate the playmaking duties. There's not going to be many opportunities for assists for Carrington. And then you got DeWanna Bonner, who's also a fluid scorer and is going to get a lot of usage. So I see the points ticking down a little bit, and I don't see really any of the other categories ticking up. So I don't think she's going to turn into a pumpkin, right? Like, I don't think this is a Cinderella story where she's fantastic and then she's going to turn into nothing. I think she'll be a valuable fantasy piece, but I just feel like if right now you can sell high and get a ton of value in return. I don't think Carrington is like a top tier fantasy player for the rest of the season. I think she'll eventually fall into like the 13, 14 point range with a couple steals every now and then.
Yeah, Carrington is one of those players who really hasn't seen enough playing time in past seasons to be a super consistent fantasy option. She's been efficient when on the court, but she just didn't have that upside because of the lack of playing time. But she's averaging 33 and a half minutes per game to begin the regular season. So she should have a pretty prominent role in a Sun backcourt that, if there's one sort of weakness on the Sky team, it's the backcourt. But she hasn't been the most reliable scorer in the past, and she's averaged 16 and a half field goal attempts per game to begin the season. So that feels like it's unsustainable. It'll probably still be higher than it was in previous seasons, but she's also relied on rebounding production in past seasons to kind of bolster her fantasy numbers. And you have to think that with Alyssa Thomas and DeWanna Bonner and Brianna Jones, once she's fully available, that the rebound numbers will be hard to come by on a team like this.
Yeah, I think Carrington is a winning player, and I think she's going to continue to get minutes, but it just feels like the right moment to sell high on her after how amazing she has been to start the season.
Yeah, absolutely. Another player that I would really like to trade for is Tina Charles. Charles was one of my biggest risk reward players early on in the season, and she's had a pretty inconsistent production to start the year. She had a really dominant double-double during the regular season opener, but she got into a little bit of foul trouble on Saturday night against the Mercury. However, her role on Wednesday signals to me that she should have a really prominent role in Atlanta, and for good reason. She's a former MVP, and she's in her age 35 season, so she'll probably have some load management later on. But I think Saturday's decline in minutes was because she picked up 3 fouls in the first half, so she just didn't have as many opportunities to contribute. But it's a small enough sample early in the season that you may be able to find a manager who's panicking a little bit after seeing Charles's role in Saturday's matchup, especially if it's someone who's maybe newer to the WNBA, doesn't really know the history behind Tina Charles. I think that if you're able to capitalize on the risk of the early season limited sample, I think that she's someone to really target. She'll likely have some games with foul trouble, but if you can get her in exchange for some relatively low profile players who have overperformed early in the season, that's a really beneficial trade. And I think one that will benefit you as the season progresses.
So Carrington for Tina Charles, who would win that trade? What would you think? I feel like that would be pretty interesting for me.
Yeah.
I feel like our major concern, or my major concern at least, with Charles going into the season was her minutes, right? Like, I felt like she could be productive in 20 minutes, but even with the foul trouble, she played 27 minutes last game. She's averaging like 29 minutes over the first 2, played 30 minutes in the opener. Like, she's the production's going to come, man. If she's getting that many minutes, even if with some foul trouble, like, the production's going to come for Tina Charles for sure. So going off of veterans, players that maybe had a bad game or two, that you could get for cheap, both Jewel Lloyd and Skylar Diggins-Smith out of Seattle have both struggled to start the season, right? But I don't expect that to change. But I do expect that to change. Diggins-Smith is currently shooting 35% from the field. She hasn't shot lower than 40% for an entire season. She's only done that once since her rookie season, which was in 2016. Lloyd is shooting 22%. She shot 37% last year, which was a career low mark. She was chucking because Stewie was out of Seattle, off to New York. So a lot of the scoring responsibilities landed on Lloyd, and she had to take more shots than usual. But for her career, Lloyd shoots 40.6% from the field. So I expect positive regression for both of them coming really soon. They're both talented scorers, and the efficiency concerns, like, there's even when they're playing well, they're still going to have some bad shooting nights, but like we harp on, there's no negative points for that. So as long as they're continuing to put up 18, 20 shots a game, they're great fantasy options, and you can reap the benefits if any managers are overreacting to the first couple games.
Yeah, the early season has been really discouraging for most of Seattle, outside of maybe Ezi Magbegor in terms of fantasy production itself. But Seattle has had some early season losses that you really didn't think that they would lose. So you thought that they would probably beat Minnesota, but they didn't. They got their first win against Washington, which was really encouraging to see. But Washington was also playing without Brittney Sykes and Shakira Austin. So you wonder just how much you can read into that, even though Seattle was also playing without Nneka Ogwumike. So I think that Jewel Lloyd and Skylar Diggins-Smith are definitely early season targets, especially with Diggins-Smith. After she missed all of last season, you could maybe find a fantasy manager who's like willing to panic and accept a trade for a player who's maybe like, I would consider Skylar Diggins-Smith to be tier 2 or 3. Maybe if you can give up a player who's in tier 4 or 5 and then try and reap the rewards later on, I think that would be beneficial. Kelsey Mitchell has also flown under the radar early in the season, but she has plenty of potential despite the presence of Caitlin Clark. Mitchell came off the bench over her first 2 appearances of the season, but reclaimed a starting role during Saturday's rematch against the Liberty and tallied 17 points, 2 rebounds, 2 assists, and 2 steals in 31 minutes. She appears to be moving past her preseason ankle injury, and she showcased solid scoring and passing skills in the past. I expect that her scoring numbers will probably decrease once Caitlin Clark can really get into a rhythm. But Kelsey Mitchell, the upside is definitely there. And if you have a fantasy manager who sees her early season minutes from the first 2 games and is concerned about that, I think that you'll be able to get a lot of value for later in the year.
Yeah, like we were talking about early with Aliyah Boston, like this Fever team is going to start scoring, and they're going to start scoring a lot. And Kelsey Mitchell is the key to that, right? Like when she was limited coming off the bench, Erica Wheeler, Lexi Hall, Christy Wallace, all solid players, but not like your starting shooting guard worth players, right? Like they were, whoever was defending them was doubling Caitlin, and they weren't really making them pay for that. Kelsey Mitchell will make you pay for doubling Caitlin Clark, right? Kelsey Mitchell can score 30 points on any night, especially when she's getting open looks. So I feel like the more Caitlin and Kelsey can play together, the better it's going to be for both of their fantasy prospects, the better it's going to be for the Fever in real life and fantasy. So yeah, she's back in the starting lineup. Those minutes are going to take up. Definitely a must trade for player if anybody has her on the market right now.
Absolutely. So to close out the show, let's preview the week ahead and talk about some matchups that we're looking forward to seeing. So for me, I'm really looking forward to seeing the Sky and Liberty face off Thursday. The Liberty had a sluggish preseason and a relatively slow start to the regular season with a narrow win over the Mystics before comfortably beating the Fever twice. The Sky, on the other hand, were expected to be one of the worst teams in the league this year just after all of their offseason losses that they had, but they've really exceeded expectations over their first 2 matchups against a Wings team that could really be in playoff contention this year. Their second game against Dallas was without Natasha Howard. The Wings were playing without Natasha Howard, so it wasn't too surprising to see the Sky finally pick up the win there. But the Wings were pretty healthy outside of Satu Sabali's injury during the regular season opener. And the Sky really looked to be in control for most of that game. During the preseason, Chicago beat New York by 48 points. And while the Liberty gave their starters plenty of rest during exhibition games, that margin is pretty significant. And I'm also intrigued to see whether Courtney Vandersloot can get into a rhythm at some point. We talked about real life versus fantasy value earlier in the show. And real life value, Courtney Vandersloot provides a solid veteran presence for the team, but the fantasy upside simply hasn't been there early in the year. She's averaged just 8.3 points, 5.3 assists, and 3.3 rebounds in 26 minutes per game to begin the year. We know the talent that Vandersloot has, but Coach Sandy Brondello has talked more this year about using the full roster rather than last year's approach of not relying on much depth. So Vandersloot is 35 years old, and she seems like a logical candidate that could see her minutes decrease because the Liberty should expect to have a long season. So limiting Vandersloot early on could help her remain available for bigger matchups and playoff games later in the year and during the playoffs.
Yeah, you see Lainey Hamilton, Ionescu, Stewart, and Jonquel Jones are all playing around 30 minutes or have played at least around 30 minutes in the first 3 games. And Vandersloot is like 27, 26, 23 type of thing. So there's clearly like that 5-minute differential where Sloot is like, she's like the odd woman out, right? And in that starting lineup where she's going to the bench more often. And you got 5 players off the Liberty bench who played at least 10 minutes in the last game. And 4 of them played at least 10 minutes in the game previous. So like you said, the bench is being utilized more often, and it's at the expense of Courtney Vandersloot, which is probably going to continue given her veteran status in the lineup. Another interesting thing to monitor about the Liberty, like we were talking about with Indiana playing a bunch of really tough teams, the Liberty have kind of played the bottom of the barrel, right? Like we said, there's no easy games in the W, and that's still true. But they've played Washington, Indiana twice, and now they're playing the Sky, who we can probably say are the bottom 3 teams in the league, right? So we haven't really seen the Liberty up against a super stiff like contender yet. And so they might be susceptible to a letdown game against the Sky for sure. My first game that I'm circling on the menu for this week is Minnesota versus Connecticut on Thursday. If Connecticut takes care of business against the Fever tonight, which is Monday, it'll be a matchup of undefeated teams. And like I mentioned earlier, they're the 3rd and 4th teams in the power rankings for ESPN and The Athletic. I have Nafissaire Collier as an MVP candidate, and this is a game where she can like kind of put her first benchmark or make her first mark on that race. She's got to go up against Dewana Bonner and Alyssa Thomas. We've talked about how great they are, but Collier is just as good. And she like why I think she's an MVP candidate is because she is the number 1 option. So while Thomas and Bonner can share opportunities and kind of take turns, Collier needs to be aggressive from the jump and not let up. These front courts are going to battle. It's going to be a super fun matchup. But I think this ultimately will come down to who can be more productive between Courtney Williams and DiJonai Carrington. Like we talked about with Carrington, she's having a fantastic start to the season, but Courtney Williams is doing the same thing for Minnesota. So while I think both of these front courts are their teams like what makes them good, I think this will come down to backcourt play.
Yeah, and with Minnesota, it's been encouraging to see them take down the Storm in their first 2 games, but they'll be playing a Sun team that really it hasn't entered the conversation of super teams, but they really should get more respect than they have because that front court is just dominant. And even though they have a bunch of veterans and they've been around for a while, like they deserve the respect of being considered among the series championship contenders. So if Minnesota can perform well against them, I think that we need to have a talk about the Lynx being among the top contenders in the league this year.
Yeah, Connecticut doesn't get any credit. I feel like that's because Jonquel Jones left. Sometimes they like leave a missing piece, but they're just like the most consistent team of that without being considered a super team for sure. And the other added thing about Courtney is she spent a lot of time in Connecticut earlier in her career, so maybe there's like a little bit of revenge factor in that too. Next up, if you tuned into any of these shows, you know how big of a Caitlin Clark stan I am, and that'll continue with a matchup on Saturday between the Fever and the Aces. Clark versus the defending champs. We've talked about how difficult their schedule has been and will be all season. This is another super tough matchup for them. This is going to be the second night of a back-to-back for the Fever and their 4th game in 6 days. That's an intense schedule. If you think about Clark coming off of, probably a tiring run to the championship game while she was at Iowa, like long season, and comes right into this. And they had already played 3 games last week. They're going to be the first team to 7 games this year. So like pretty crazy schedule for them to start. 12 of the 14 games in the W so far have been won by the team with the experience advantage. So obviously the Aces have way more experience than the Fever. So picking the Aces isn't really going out on a limb, but precedent tells us this one shouldn't really be close. I'm sure the Fever will be double-digit dogs. But I'm looking for Kelsey Mitchell and Alyssa Smith to stabilize the Fever and give the youngsters, Clark and Boston, a shot to compete against the champs. Without Chelsea Gray, I think the Fever might have a chance to cover in this one, but I'm just hoping that it's competitive and Clark can put another good performance in her cap.
Yeah, like you said, I'm not really expecting to go out and target the Fever money line or anything, but I think that if the Fever are able to stay in this game, it'll really give us a sense of where the Fever are at. For different reasons, I'm looking forward to Indiana facing the Sparks on Friday. The Fever have had a brutal early season schedule, as we've talked about, and it won't get easier for the next week and a half. I don't want to call the Sparks an easy opponent by any means because they have plenty of talent and there are no easy opponents in the WNBA. With just 144 players, there isn't room for players who are less than the top caliber of players, and that's what you have around the league. But I don't think that it's a bold claim to say that the Sparks aren't really on the same tier as teams like the Sun, Liberty, and Aces. So I think that Friday's game will help to provide a benchmark of what we can expect from the Fever later on this season. Like we've talked about, the Fever have had a gauntlet early in the season. So it's a tough task to compete with some of the league's top teams while also developing chemistry among young players. And the matchup against the Sparks should really give the Fever a chance to face a team that's in a relatively similar situation to them, where we've seen the Sparks. They have some veteran talent, but really their two headline players coming into the season have been Cameron Brink and Rickea Jackson, and both of them haven't had super flashy numbers. So both of the teams are kind of waiting for their young players to step up before they can really reach a level of new success in the league.
Yeah, Cameron Brink numbers like points and rebounds haven't been spectacular, but 7 blocks through 2 games. I saw a tweet the other day or an X post, whatever you want to call it. I'm still going to call it Twitter and tweets because that's just the kind of person I am. But they were like, man, we got the women's version of Anthony Davis already. And so, I mean, 5 blocks for a rookie in her second game going up against the Aces. She blocked A'ja Wilson. I was watching, I only tuned in for a little bit, but A'ja kind of tried to body her, came to a jump stop and pump fake. Brink didn't go for it. And then Wilson kind of fell and Brink didn't even need to jump and she just swatted that stuff out of there. So I think Brink, she looks pretty confident on the offensive end. Not many shots fell against the Aces, but Brink has been a huge surprise to me for sure. I expected her to struggle defensively and offensively to start. I thought the defense would get there eventually, but it looks like immediately she's going to be a strong defender, and it's just a matter of time to see when that offensive game comes around. And like the Fever, the Sparks, we call them the rebuilding Sparks, and I felt like they played really well in their first 2 games. They're 0-2, but they played Atlanta and the Aces. So those are 2 really tough matchups to get started. Both were 10-point finishes eventually, but I've been encouraged from what I've seen from the Sparks, even if they haven't won a game yet.
Yeah, and Lexi Brown has underperformed a little bit, but she figures to come back into form pretty soon. But to see Dearica Hamby and Layshia Clarendon step up the way that they have is really encouraging for this team and shows that even if Cameron Brink and Rickea Jackson take a little bit of time to develop, which is understandable, the Sparks are able to afford it at this point because they have veteran leadership that they can rely on.
100%. Hamby, I was trying to think do I want to trade for Hamby or do I want to trade Hamby away? So I just left her off of our trade pieces, but she's been a super interesting performer so far this season too. I think for right now, I don't want to trade her away just because I don't think Rickea Jackson's going to get a large role until probably the second half of the season when they're out of the playoff picture. But Hamby is in a really perfect situation right now where she's got these youngsters around me, we're rebuilding, but I can make my mark right now, and has been fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. With Hamby, she's someone who, if you have her, you're really pleased. If you had to play against her in the week one matchups, not so pleased. But she's been a really bright spot for the Sparks early on. So that does it for our Monday show of the RotoWire RotoWire WNBA show. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back Friday at 1 p.m. Central again. We'll break down the week's action. We'll talk about some must-add players again, and we'll talk about the weekend ahead. Join us then. Thanks.